Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, specifically a pair of graphic novels. I am back on that graphic novel grind. Or not back, I've been there for a while. But I wanted to talk about a graphic novel series that is about World War II, the Holocaust, and one that's told in an unusual manner. I am referring to Mouse Part 1 and 2 by Art Spiegelman. For those who don't know, Art Spiegelman is an author who was born in the 1950s. He's known for writing comics mostly. He was the editor of Raw magazine, which published many comics, including his own. And his first big break was when he published the series of Mouse, which was published in different forms between 1970 and the late 1980s. Eventually, he won a Pulitzer Prize for part 1 and 2 of Mouse, before going on to publish other works and writing for The New Yorker. I don't think he's done too much since then in terms of other things published. He's published some other stories, including a retrospective on Mouse, but it hasn't been anything too large that's been notable. What has been notable, though, is the controversy that's been happening in the past month, or 2 months, I think it is. A school district in Tennessee banned the book Mouse Part 1 and 2 for obscenity, which there is some nudity in here, but there's not too much. They're just saying it's inappropriate for children. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but, I'm not a fan of banning books in general. And although, it might not be appropriate for certain age groups, we shouldn't be outright banning the book from being taught in school districts. And I think Art Spiegelman said very much the same, and there's been a lot of uproar about that, especially as it pertains to this whole culture war that we're in. But that's another point entirely. So the story of Mouse is told as a sort of framing narrative. Vladek in the 1970s is telling the story of his life to his son Art, so it's sort of autobiographical or sort of semi-biographical. Art, who is aspiring comic book writer of some sorts. And so Vladek begins to tell Art about his time in the concentration camps and his progress towards that point in time. And he begins talking about his relationship with Anya in 1937 when they were both living in Poland. They eventually get married, and Anya's father gives him a textile factory, which helps him make a fair bit of money, so things seem to be going well for Vladek at this time. But you can see that they're in Poland and it's 1937, so the good times can't last forever. And indeed, you begin seeing more signs of the Nazis at this point, as Vladek says, and some anti-Jewish sentiment, anti-Semitic sentiments that were common in Europe historically, but have grown even more so as the Nazis gained power in World War II. And this all culminates in Vladek being sent to war, being conscripted into the Poland army to fight against the Nazis. However, things don't turn out well for Vladek, and he becomes a war prisoner, forced to work for the German army. But after a certain amount of time, he is given his freedom, and he is sent back to to his family where he reunites with Anya. But things aren't so well at this point because although they are technically free, the Nazis have begun forming ghettos and forcing the Nazis to conform to a whole bunch of restrictions such as curfew and being forced to wear different colored badges, and over time, more of Anya's family and more of Vladek's family begins being sent to the prison camps. And so Anya and Vladek are forced to hide in cellars and rely on the kindness of people who they aren't so kind because they're worried that the Nazis might eventually turn on them and they want to have someone to sell out to, or they believe that by hiding Jews it makes them a magnet in some sort of way. Eventually, Vladek and Anya are caught by the Nazis and they are sent to Auschwitz, where they are separated. Vladek is sent to the main Auschwitz camp, while Anya is sent to Birkenau, and they do manage to keep in contact, but not as much, and Vladek fears that Anya might one day be killed or executed or sent to the gas chambers, as the Nazis were doing in these camps. Back in the present, though, Vladek begins to become more difficult, especially as his health deteriorates near the end of his life. He notes that he's missing Anya more and more. He's in a new relationship after Anya committed suicide in the 60s with a woman named Mala, but Mala and him don't really get along, and largely because of finance-related reasons. And Vladek has a difficult time keeping her around. But while Art is getting the story, he wants to know more about Anya's journals so he can get her side of the story too. But Vladek reveals that he burnt her journals a long time ago so he could be done with Anya and get over what had happened to him in terms of Auschwitz, but also in terms of Anya's death. And at that point, Art even calls him a murderer because he murdered the memory of Anya. Mala eventually leaves Vladek, and Vladek is left on his own, and Art has to help him out a little bit more as his health again begins to deteriorate. But they talk more and more about the story of Vladek's past. He notes that when he went to Auschwitz, he was protected initially by a capo who helped make things a little bit easier for him, getting him sort of easy jobs and protecting him when people were sent to the gas chambers and killed. In the present, Art talks about Vladek's death in the 1970s, and you see a bit more of the guilt and frustration that he feels that is present throughout this entire story, and I'll go on a bit when I get to the analysis section. It focuses back on Vladek, and he's talking about how Anya is in Birkenau. They managed to pass letters and whatnot, as I noted before. Vladek has many jobs where he works as a tin man and a shoe cobbler, gaining a little skill in each area and being protected because of his skill in those areas. He also witnesses the gas chambers, not in action, but he sees them happen, whereas he notes that other people had only heard about it through rumor. He has eyewitness account there. He also talks about how he was sent to Dachau near the end of the war because the Nazis wanted to cover their tracks with Auschwitz. And the time there was pretty terrible too. But eventually the front arrives, the American soldiers arrive, and the Nazis just send all the Jews, march them down elsewhere into Germany, where they're eventually freed by the American soldiers, and they just hang around for a period of time before eventually Vladek decides to return back home, back to Poland, where he finds that many of the Polish people have taken over businesses and houses, and there's no recourse for really any of the Jewish people to reclaim that. But he is reunited with Anya, and as the story ends, that there's a really happy note there, that even though they went through this entire suffering, he at least gets to be back with Anya. In terms of analysis, there is a lot to talk about with this story. It's a pretty interesting story. Very, very good, very wonderful. I'm definitely going to recommend it. I could talk about, the main theme of like man's and humanity towards man, but I feel like that's a cliche to talk about. But that is there, like seeing how the Polish people and the Germans and everyone, like, they discriminate against their fellow countrymen just because they're Jewish, just because they're different in that sort of way, and how they're willing to watch as those people get exterminated and do nothing. Like some people help out by hiding, but a lot of people just ignore or push it to the side, maybe because there's a war going on. But it really is hard to see, and I think Spiegelman does a good job of getting at that sort of suffering and the tolerance of that suffering that we allow and watch happen. Another thing that Spiegelman talks about is survival. Vladek and his family are willing to do anything to survive. Not only Vladek, but everyone in World War II, everyone in Auschwitz and Dachau are trying their best to survive any way they can. In the ghettos, in the prison camps and trains, there's a Jewish man who hides in the town sort of dump well of sorts, like hiding amongst the trash in order to escape the Nazis, hiding in barns, doing anything they can to survive. And as a result of this, you can't really form friendships. You're not allowed, it's not that you're not allowed, it's just that if you form friendships, you're going to watch your friend die, or you're going to have to give up something in order to help that friend survive, and you just can't afford to do that. You can't afford to give up your food, because if you look skinny or weak, the Nazis are going to go send you to the gas chambers. They're going to send you to the ovens and kill you, and nobody really wants that. They want to live, although some people have resigned themselves to they're going to die eventually. It's just a matter of time of when. And not only are there no friendships, family bonds sort of break apart too, where like Vladek and Anya both want to save their family, but they can't, because it's either them or their family members who are going to the prison camps that they've heard like are these places of death. So these survival conditions force the friendships and family bonds to break in just a short amount of time, and it's really hard to read and hear about. At the same time that I was reading this, I've had to sit in on a Holocaust class for one of for my job to make it more accessible. I've had to sit on a Holocaust class, and just hearing about the conditions there and also in this book really sells you on like how hard it was to live during this time, to be Jewish or a prisoner of war under the Nazis. It was a pretty hard time. And again, this is all really reflective of the conditions that the Nazis opposed. They created this situation where the Nazis couldn't form friendships, where capos rose up in order to survive, but like those capos, who were other Jews most of the time, who seemingly sold out their own brethren, like they thought that would get them an edge and not get them killed. But as Vladek notes multiple times, it does get them killed, or it doesn't protect them as much as they thought it would. The Nazis don't care about the Jewish people, and in not caring about the Jewish people at all and viewing them as worthy of being exterminated, like they pretty much ruin the foundation and ruin like an entire generation. Because in my next point, like, think of the long-term impact of all of this. And yeah, so that's my next point, which is look at the long-term impact of all the trauma that's being developed during the Holocaust. Vladek in his old age is a bitter, angry, kind of penny-pinching, annoying old man, according to Mala and his son Art. Like Mala says, she can barely, she doesn't want to be with him most of the time, and she notes that like she went through the prison camps too, and she is nowhere near as agitating and annoying as he is. So like, why is that the case for Vladek? I think it's a consequence of the Holocaust itself. because he, like Mala says, it isn't, but I believe that it might be. That for Vladek, like, he had to survive with very little. And so he saves every penny that he can in case another situation like this arises. It probably won't, but Vladek can't be too sure. Like, he probably didn't guess in his youth that, like, years later there would be a Holocaust where everything that you have would be taken from you. And that's another big point. Like, when Vladek returns, he hears stories about people trying to reclaim their businesses or their homes, and they're either kicked out of town or outright murdered by the Polish people who took over those businesses. So even when the Nazis aren't there, there's no protection from having just everything taken from you. So it's easy to see how Vladek got this way, especially with the death of his wife Anya. This isn't the life that he wanted. Maybe when he was younger and before the start of the Troubles, like he saw his life going on a certain path, and the Nazis took that away from him by creating a whole bunch of trauma and pain that he had to deal with, and it would make any of us bitter. And it seems to have, like, poison, not poison, but created generational trauma for a whole great number of Jewish individuals. And this is passed down to his son, who never lived through the Holocaust, but heard it so much from his father. There's a good quote that I would like to read to you from this. "I never felt guilty about Rousseau, but I did have nightmares about SS men coming into my class and dragging all us Jewish kids away. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't obsessed with this stuff. It's just that sometimes I'd fantasize Zyklon B coming out of our shower instead of water. I know this is insane, but I somehow wish I had been in Auschwitz with my parents, so I could really know what they lived through. I guess it's some kind of guilt about having had an easier life than they did. Sigh. I feel so inadequate trying to reconstruct a reality that was worse than my darkest dreams." And there you get the feeling of Art, who is talking about losing a brother that he never knew and being kind of jealous that, like, his father loved Rousseau for being like the son he never had. But Art was here the whole time and he never had the same love. And his father talked about the concentration camps. So even though Art never went through the concentration camps, he had an understanding of what to expect and the fear that a Jewish man might have gone through. So there's a whole bunch of frustration and guilt and turmoil within Art. Like, he understands the life that was in the concentration camps, even though he never went through it. And that creates a rift between him and his father, because he wants to connect with him, but he can't, largely because maybe he's not Rousseau, the son that he maybe actually wanted, but also because like Vladek and Art have completely different lives. Like, Art is never going to know truly what it's like to be persecuted in such a way like the Holocaust. And so there's that difference that in expectations of what to expect from life. So all of this was passed down to his son. This is generational trauma, a very clear example if you demonstrate to someone what that's like. But I do wonder what role religion plays in all of this, especially the Jewish religion, Judaism, because I feel like the story would play out if it was the Christian religion versus the Muslim religion versus Jewish religion, because this is not just an isolated experience for the Jewish people. For centuries, millennia even, the Jewish people have been kicked around, pushed out of cities, pushed out of entire countries, all for the sake of being the outsider. And so while it was never as bad to the extent maybe of the Holocaust, it was still pretty bad, where many Jewish individuals were killed or put on trial or just exiled in some sort of way, put on trial in the Inquisition in Spain. And I do feel like religion does play a role here. Like, is this more than just the Holocaust? Is this centuries of Jewish pain building up in Vladek and being passed on to Art in a way? Maybe that's the case. I don't know if that's what Art is actually getting at, but you could make an argument for that that's those centuries of pain being passed down from generation to generation, making it very difficult to get along with your parents and to understand their experiences in life. Other stuff that I think is wonderful in this comic are the art and the use of animals, specifically highlighting like mouse for, the Jewish people, pigs for the Polish people, dogs for the Americans, and cats for the Jewish Nazi type people. I like it, and it as someone else has pointed out, it really highlights the absurdity of dividing people up in that sort of way. That we're all sort of like one human race, and yet we choose to divide ourselves up into these absurd categories that aren't really real. Another element that I really like about this is the structure of the storytelling, which is out of time, going back and forth between the present and the past, even after Vladek's death, and how Art is trying to reconcile all of this and how he's not really successful. I think it's a really good way of telling the story, and it definitely works in Mouse. Another thing is I do wish they would have made Anya a bigger character, but as Art noted, like his father burnt Anya's journals, so he couldn't really tell that story about her. But again, I guess I just wish the story was a little bit different so we can learn about Anya, but unfortunately, that is not the case. The last thing I'll talk about is how does this relate to today? This seems like it's especially relevant today, considering it's being banned still. And I if you want to know why it's banned, my opinion is that Mouse presents a very pessimistic, cynical view of humanity, where it's not evil leaders who cause us to do bad things. It's rather our own tolerance of the bad actions of those leaders that allows stuff like the Holocaust to happen. Hitler made his policies, but the German Nazi soldiers enacted it. The Polish people allowed it to go on without saying a word or without speaking out in large numbers. And the capos, like that's a difficult situation in the camps, but like the capos, like they rose up and gained power and treated others pretty poorly. And so like this is a very cynical view of humanity, and it dares to say, like, we are the source of our own suffering, not these great evil men like Hitler. Like, Hitler definitely enables all this to happen, but we have the power to say no, and in this case, we didn't. And so it's a very powerful and very hard message to learn, and I can see why some people would want to ban that. But I do feel that this is especially relevant in today's world, where more Nazis, more white supremacists are gaining power, not only in the United States but in other countries. And this can be very frustrating because you would think that we said that was bad in the 1940s. Why is it back? And I think the issue is that when we won World War II, we pointed fingers at the Germans. We didn't point fingers at the entire European system that allowed anti-Semitism to continue for centuries. Anti-Semitism was present in Europe in a number of ways, as I have noted previously, and no one ever called that out to a large extent. We merely said Germany's to blame, fix your problem, and they did for the most part. But the anti-Semitism in Europe was allowed to thrive. And because America never has truly addressed its own problems with prejudice and racism and our own structural inequalities, I feel like that's allowed white supremacy and Nazism to flourish and reflourish over time. And so what we're left with is politicians who, like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Donald Trump or Steve King or Ted Cruz, who say things that empower their white supremacist base. They might not fully believe those messages, but it gets their bases revving and moving and ready to vote and do things on their behalf. And that's unfortunate, but I think it gets at this message is that if we don't have enough people speaking out about it in the media, on the streets, elsewhere, if we just allow this to go on, this is what you end up with. You end up with the Holocaust. You end up with people in prison camps camps. You end up with people who lose their rights and who lose their dignity. And it's a history that nobody really wants to confront, but is going to be repeated over and over until we actually acknowledge the history of inequality and racism in this country, as well as other problems faced in multiple other countries. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Maus by Art Spiegelman, a really amazing series of stories, collection. It's part 1 and 2. I definitely recommend that you go read it out there. I apologize if my review is being a little preachy, but that's the point of Maus, is to highlight what's wrong and urge people to go fix it, even looking inward with yourself. I know I'm not perfect and I have a lot of things to fix. This has made me more aware of like issues that the complacency, especially, that allow bad stuff to go on in the world, that I have to be careful and point out when I see something wrong and not just stay quiet about it. So I recommend this. Read this. Make sure that schools don't go out and ban it too. It's a hard truth, and everyone needs to hear it. If you read this before, comment below. Let's have a discussion about Maus. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about Maus and Art Spiegelman if they don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and mousy travels. Farewell, and all Nazis are terrible people. Don't let them rise up. They suck.